you want to learn how to read your LiveScope better, then stick around, because we're going to show you a bunch of screenshots and examples of exactly what you're looking for when you are trying to find fish or weeds or structure or bait. I'll show you a bunch of different examples of all of those, plus a bunch more tips and tricks to help you be more efficient and effective when using your LiveScope. Well, welcome back. If you're new around here, my name is TJ Erickson. I'm a teacher and former fishing guide based out of beautiful Park Rapids, Minnesota. And like I said, today we're going to give you a bunch of tips to help you read and understand your LiveScope better. And one of the first things that you need to understand before you even get into identifying fish or weeds or anything is just understanding the scale. If you're looking for more of like an introduction, orientation, what the beams look like, I have a video that I'll drop down below. That's kind of a precursor maybe to this. This one is more on screen, what you're seeing, how to identify fish and weeds, and all of those other different things. So when we're talking scale, we are talking your depth down and your distance that you are shooting out. For example, right now my depth is on auto, it's at 31. I'm shooting out at about 100 feet, and you can actually see a little bit of scattered weeds. You can actually see a fish right at about 40 feet. I'll circle that here, and I just wanted to show you what the scale does when you change it. You can see that fish there. If I go shallower, if I want to show a little less depth, you can actually see how that fish already looks a little bit bigger. And then I will also show you what it looks like when I move the distance. You can see that fish at 40 feet. If I do both of them a little bit, that fish is going to look a lot bigger. And so a lot of people will get confused because maybe they thought some fish were walleyes and they end up being panfish, but really pay attention to your scale. Let me reset that here. And so there you can actually see another fish out at 45 feet, and you can see that looks pretty significant. And I'm actually going to probably reuse that screenshot because you can easily tell that it's swimming towards us. One, because of obviously moving the tail, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. But I just wanted to show you what it looks like when you are moving that scale, how much bigger those fish can look, or when you move it out, how much smaller those fish can look. You can see now that fish right there, it's kind of getting into that stitching, but it's looking significantly smaller. I'm also going to show you those weeds, what they look like. So I'm going to move up a little shallower. You can see some weeds and you can see some bait. You can see when I move deeper and farther away, you can see how that changes when I move shallower and I move it closer in. You can really get a little bit better picture of what you're seeing. I'll go even a little bit deeper, a little more zoomed in picture of what you're seeing. And you can even see some smaller fish sitting up on top of those weeds. So understanding scale is one of the key factors in identifying what you're seeing on the screen. The other thing that I really wanted to talk about that can really make a difference as to what you're looking at, being able to identify what you're seeing, is the color palette that you're using. You can see that I'm using blue. I'm not sure if I'll edit out the blue on a lot of my videos. I take that out so it's a black background because I like that a lot better. I like the look of it. And so if anybody from Garmin is seeing this, I've gotten a lot of comments on my videos that people really like that. I like it as well. If you could give us that option, that would be great. But there's a few reasons why I like the blue color palette, and one of the main ones is I can really easily tell the density of maybe whatever I'm looking at. Maybe it's fish, maybe it's weeds, whatever it is, I can easily tell the density because of how much red I'm seeing. Another thing is just the contrast between the yellow, the red, and the blue. I really like that. It seems to just fit my eyes, helps me understand what I'm reading. Again, this is a little bit of a preference thing, but not all of the color palettes will be able to help you see some of that density a little more clearly like this one does. One little note on settings that I should mention is I have my color gain bumped up quite a bit. If you watch any of my settings videos, I'll put those in the description down below as well if you're interested in checking out my settings. But I like to bump that color gain up, which essentially makes that density, everything seem a little more dense than maybe what you're used to seeing on some of these. I like that, gives me a little more information to play with, helps me to really identify some of these fish. But if it looks different than maybe what you're used to, that might be part of it. So I wanted to mention that as well. The next thing we're going to talk about is bottom hardness. You know, a lot of people are really good at reading it on side imaging. That's a very, very easy way to tell bottom hardness, but you can actually tell that on LiveScope as well. Now keep in mind, the further you get out, sometimes this changes, but in general, the harder, the more red that you see, the harder the bottom. The thinner red, that is going to be softer bottom, might even go to orange or yellow, depending on how your settings are set. But I'm kind of pan around here and just kind of show you and identify some of the things. This is an area that has quite a bit of stuff, so I thought it would be a good opportunity. So you can see the weeds, you can actually see the weed edge as I pan around there. Another fish swimming above those weeds. Again, these ones are not a little more sparse, they're a little bit thicker. Another thing that you might see with weeds, you might see some of the low lying, it's more of like the chara or the sandgrass, a lot of times we call it. That is low lying. Honestly, that might look just like you're seeing bottom, but you can definitely tell when you're identifying some of these areas that there's going to be a little bit of a raise, and it looks just a little bit different than the bottom. Now that we've seen some weeds, I'm going to show you what that harder bottom, a little bit more rocky areas look like. We're just getting up to it here. You can see there are still some weeds here as well, but as I kind of pan around, I'm going to move out a little bit deeper there. For sure, you can see one bigger rock right there. I'll pan around. This is a combination, actually. You see some weeds mixed in. I can actually see it on the side imaging right here. I'll kind of mark what it looks like on the side imaging so you can kind of get an idea what it's looking like on the LiveScope. So as I kind of pan around, a little bit harder to tell on some of these, especially because we're on a brake line. Anytime you're on some somewhat steep brakes, it's a lot harder to tell what you're looking at. So just a little caveat there. But as I pan around, you can definitely see, obviously, there's a couple bigger rocks. There's bait sitting on top of it. I'm going to keep panning around. You can actually see, this is one of the things I want to talk about, you can actually see some fish there as well. There's one suspended. I'll try to bump up to get a little better picture of that. 3 smaller marks kind of swimming around in those rocks. There you can see a little better separation, and so that's one of the things you're looking for when you're looking for rocks. Usually they're going to be connected. Sometimes the fish are swimming around in the rocks. It's going to be kind of hard to differentiate, but most often you are going to see fish that are just going to be up off bottom just a little bit. You can actually see those couple fish right there. I'm going to zoom in a little bit, just give you a little better picture. You can actually see those fish right there, a little bit higher off bottom, moving a little bit, especially now that that one's moving. You can identify that quite a bit easier, but those are pretty low lying. So if you're making a quick pass, you might not see those as fish right away. You might identify those as rock. So again, when you're looking for fish within the rocks, wanting to identify separation off bottom, but also a little bit of that movement, just like you see those right there, who actually a little better fish. So the next thing that I want to kind of talk you through is what you're going to see when you're looking at bait. I actually have a bunch of it right up here. You can see there's a thicker red mark at about 60 feet. I'm going to go out a little bit again to let you see that. Thicker red mark, and then you can see all that almost looks like clutter. That is going to be a lot of times maybe small perch, maybe shiners. Sometimes you can see those shiners really close to the surface. They're these very, very small groups of minnows like that. You see them in big groups. A lot of times you see them gathered. This one you can actually see there's some separation in them. Sometimes if you're far enough away, they're going to be so tight that it almost looks like one big group that's moving together. The other thing to note is not all bait is going to look exactly the same. These ones are very, very small bait. Now you can also identify even a little bit larger bait like ciscos or maybe smelt. The ciscos are going to obviously not be quite as big as fish, and they're going to be in groups like that, but sometimes they get really close together. It can be very deceiving. You can think that they're maybe a good sized fish, but then they separate when you get a bait to them or whatever, get it at a different angle maybe. Important to keep your settings similar, and important to keep your scale similar so that we can help to identify some of those. And the more time you spend on it, the easier it's going to be and the quicker you're going to be able to recognize some of these. So there again, you can see another fish just kind of swimming among that bait. It got in that stitching. I'll even pause it there for a second where it stopped because it was in that stitching. You almost saw that line. That's where those beams are being stitched together. And anytime you have a fish or something get in there, it's going to look a little bit different. Now you can see it swimming out of that stitching. Now it becomes a lot more clear and a lot more complete. And again, you can see another small pot of bait going right underneath there at about 5 feet or so as well. So now we're going to get into a little bit more of the more advanced stuff, and we're going to talk about fish direction. How can you tell what direction that these fish are swimming? Obviously, like that first one I showed you, you can tell it by the distance it is moving. So maybe it's moving further away from you. You can tell that it's obviously moving that direction or moving closer. Those are a little bit easier. Right to left, you can also identify that. If you're looking at a fish and all of a sudden it's starting to kind of get out of your cone and you move it to the right or to the left and it comes back into your cone, then you're going to be able to tell obviously it's moving right or left. So being able to see which way they're moving and time your cast is a very big part of this when you're trying to make a fish, especially on like some of the open water stuff. Another thing, you can actually tell the movement of the fish sometimes by the shape of it. That head, and right behind the head is a little bit more of the thicker part, kind of comes to a point, especially with some of these bigger fish. And then when you get to the tail on bigger fish specifically, something interesting happens because it gets that hump over the head, drops back down to that thinner part of the tail, and you almost lose some of that fish right there, some of that return. So it almost looks like it's separate fish, but then you can see that tail moving back and forth. On that fish earlier, I think I showed you that. But there's some other examples here of that exact thing happening where it almost looks like two fish, but really it is one bigger fish, and you're seeing that movement of that tail. So obviously the tail side, it's moving in the opposite direction. So there's a few ways to be able to differentiate and be able to tell what way these fish are moving. Gonna get even a little more advanced and talk finding fish in the weeds. Now this is especially helpful when you're targeting some of these bigger fish in the weeds. You know, sometimes I'll pan around and see if I can see some here. Sometimes you can identify fish because they are going to be above those weeds. I don't necessarily see any right here. There's one right there. So there you can see at about 40, 45, there's one, maybe two, but you're looking for that thicker red mark. That one, a little easier to see because it's sitting above those weeds. So if there's some thicker stuff and they're sitting above, pretty easy to see. Now you're starting to identify that that other one is also a fish because you're starting to see a little bit more of that movement. So when you are looking for fish in the weeds, a few things that I'm looking for, you can see obviously these very thick red, almost looking like circles. Bigger fish, they're going to be a little bit longer, a little bit narrower. But another thing that I do is look for movement like we just saw there. We saw those ones starting to move, especially if you get a bait around them, you'll see that. But the other thing that's really helpful is being able to identify the horizontal lines. If you've ever been a deer hunter, I know this is a lesson my dad taught me early on. When a deer stops, it's hard to see, just like a fish. When you're looking at the LiveScope, the fish can be hard to see when they stop moving, especially if they're thick into some weeds and not sitting on top. So what you're looking for is you're looking for those weeds, which are typically straight up and down. Then you're looking for the horizontal part. I'll show you some examples here. That horizontal part, or that little bit thicker part where it looks perpendicular to some of these weeds. Again, you're also looking for that little bit bigger size, that little more dense. Again, settings are a huge thing. Being able to understand your scale and your settings makes a big difference in this, makes it much more easy to be able to tell, and nothing is going to beat time on the water as well. But being able to understand the density of these, sometimes you'll get fooled, especially when those weeds are laying over like that, makes a little bit of a curl, can look a lot like the top of a fish. So there you saw a bunch of examples, a bunch of screenshots. I hope you found this helpful. Again, nothing's gonna replace time on the water, but hopefully this will shorten that learning curve. I would like to continue doing some more of these. I have some other ideas in the work, some ice fishing ones, some other things. So if you have anything that you would like to see, anything you're not sure of on the LiveScope that you would like help reading or defining, put that in the comments below, and I'll do my best to add that to the list for the next video of these like I do. Again, hope you found some value in this video. If you did, I would love it if you would subscribe. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.